In this part of the homemade mini bike build series, I'm going to be showing you how to make a basic frame that can take a variety of different engines, wheel sizes, and drivetrains. And a knot spool through it. Tube just comes down to the side and up. Ooh, air filter.
What a day. Might as well give her a...
In the last part of our custom homemade mini bike build series, we took a look at making this, which is a frame jig. The frame jig will help us in the assembly process, making sure everything is aligned and square. On our material list, we're going to have two 90-inch pieces of DOM steel, drawn over manual steel. I'm going to show you with a couple different sizes of necks so we can get set up with different forks, different triple trees. We're going to have ourselves two different axle tabs. I'll give you some information in the description below, so check back when I finally am able to get that up. And we need an engine plate. Now this particular engine plate, if you notice, has various sizes on it. It has size for small block on a small wheel, small block on a large wheel, and a large block engine. So 440cc engine, and I've got a variety of different engines. In the next part of the build series that I'll be showing you what you can do to create a custom mini bike. We're going to start with two 90-inch long pieces of DOM, which is drawn over manual steel. And we have our step-by-step instructions, so if you care to screen capture those as we go along, feel free to follow along with that. One of the primary tools I'm going to be using here is a tubing roller. And the tubing roller allows us to get an arc in the back of the mini bike, which allows us to put in a larger engine or give more engine space. I think there are a variety of different ways that we can go about making our mini bike build. Once you get a basic idea of how to put the frame together, you can omit certain parts or you can add different parts in. So we're just going to add this in and give you an example of using a tubing roller. So I've got a written up step-by-step instruction sheet. I'm going to have two 90-inch pieces of DOM, and I'm going to mark them after I wipe them down. So the very first step here, cut 90-inch pieces of DOM, wipe down with WD-40. Why am I wiping them down with WD-40? So typically when you get a roll of steel like this, it's going to be coated in oil to prevent it from rusting. So if I grab some paper towels, a little bit of WD-40, and I wipe it down, I'm going to be able to take off the oil layer and the protective coating. This makes it a lot easier when I make my markings to be able to get the perfect measurements on the piece of steel. However, once I'm done, if I'm not going to be putting an immediate finish on the frame, I am going to recoat it using transmission fluid. This should give it a nice protective coat to prevent the rust from occurring. When I want to wipe that transmission fluid off, again, I just come back to the WD-40. So now that I have two clean pieces of steel to work with, I'm going to take my tape measure and I'm going to make marks along both of these rods. I'm going to make my first mark at 1 3/4 inch, then 6 inches, 23 inches, 34 inches, 55 inches, 67 inches, 77.5, and 85 inches. And when I make those marks along this piece of steel, I want to make sure that I'm going from the factory edge, or a very clean edge, to start with the tape measure. Now that I've cleaned off all the oil, I should be able to make marks on the steel that I can come back to and pick up with my eye. But that's not the only thing that I'm going to do with these measurements. It's just using a piece of tape, marking it along the side where you made your marks, and being able to go off of the tape. So now I've marked all of my lines with tape on one side so it's steady and consistent, and now I can double check my measurements and make sure that everything is going to be aligned perfectly between the two sides. My tape is very thick. You should be using a very narrow tape if you're going to do this. In the first about 1/2 inch to 3/4 inch of the die, it's not going to be touching and rubbing against the metal, so it should be fine, but anywhere past that, you don't want the tape to be pushing up against the metal as you make your bend. Because I use the tape, I've now found that when I do my verifications for measurements, that one of the lines is actually marked just over 55 inches and one of them just under 55 inches. So I can use the tape and readjust the position and get these two more accurate. It's time to start rolling. So what I do is I put the 6 inch to 23 inch starting end into the tubing roller itself, and I take a digital angle, I turn it on, and I zero it out. When I'm looking between 6 inches and the 23 inch marker, I'm going to be looking straight through this little hole that's in the tubing roller, and I'm going to be stopping at the 6 inch mark. I'm going to be doing a roll, and I'm going to be stopping at the 23 inch mark. Between those, as I'm rolling it up, I'm going to take my digital angle. I want to stay under the measurement angle of 50 degrees. So I'm going to be rolling it slowly back and forth between the two marks, and I'm going to be making sure that it stays at 50 degrees when it's done. Now, one more thing that I do while I'm bending this is I take my fine tip marker again, and I'm going to be making a mark directly on the top in a straight line. And while I roll, I'm going to be using a pipe wrench to be able to put some weight on there and make sure that this thing isn't going to be getting wavy as I roll it. "40 degrees. So now I want to go a little bit slower since I'm already at 40 degrees and I want to only get to 50 degrees. Your last couple of rolls going back and forth are going to go faster than you think, adding up those degrees. So what you want to do is make a small turn over here, maybe a 16th of a turn, even if that, and then roll it back and forth a couple of times. Once you've rolled it back and forth a couple of times, roll it all the way to that 6-inch mark, all the way there. Then take a look, and that is where you're going to be measuring it from. So you can see I've got just a couple more degrees to go. All right, there we go. So now we move on to the next side, and we put that at 50 degrees as well. Now that I have the two pieces both bent, what I'm going to do is make minor adjustments. I can put this under something heavy and just tweak it a little bit, making sure that all of these pieces of tape line up perfectly to one another when I put one bar on top of the other. The first bend we're going to be having here at the 34-inch mark is a 130 degree bend, and it's going to be our neck. I made sure that the metal is in place with the rounded part being outward because that's the part that's going to be folding in on our bend. Now I've secured the locking bolt and I've lined that 34-inch mark right up flush to the die. The die doesn't actually start bending for about 1 inch in. With some benders, it's a little bit different, and I'll go over that later on in the video. I'm going to take some WD-40 now, and I'm going to lubricate along the end of this metal rod so that it can go really smooth as it's making its bend. All right, I've moved everything up to the 77.5-inch mark, going directly in line with the die here, and I'm going to make another 130 degree angle bend, and that's going to be where our tail sits. I've now moved everything back to the 55-inch mark to make a 65 degree bend, and that should bring these two sides together pretty close to one another where they're lined up. When I get to the point where the two metal bars are touching, I can lift one up above the other to get the bend to 65 degrees. Now in this particular case, I've got my 85-inch mark and my 1 3/4-inch mark lining up perfectly. But I'm going to go a little bit past that because when I release the bender, it's going to bounce back a little bit. And that takes me to 65 degrees. They are overlapping from where they should be. Let's see what happens when I release the bender. So I've got my 1 3/4-inch marker lined up almost perfectly to my 85-inch marker. Now, why did I have the extra on? Why did I have all of this excess on? And that really was that this is needed to be here to rest up against the die to create the bend. And this part right here needed to be on there for the tubing roller to rest up against the die so that I could actually get that bend in place. This part here and this part here are about to be cut off so we can weld our two sides together. So now that I have my two pieces, I'm going to completely ignore the 85-inch mark and the 1 3/4 inch mark. And those were really for reference as I was assembling things to gauge where everything would line up. I'm actually going to be coming about 1 inch from our starting point, our factory starting point, and going up and looking at where everything lines up for these two tubes and two frame pieces to come together nicely. I'm going to be lining up both of the pieces, checking back and forth between the two, squaring them up to see that they're going to be coming out the same. I will then cut one piece, and I'm going to line up the second piece directly with the first piece I cut. So there are no measurements here. This is going to account for any little wiggle room or any little degree of error between the two pieces while they were in the bending process. Chop, chop. Now I want to have a seamless weld. In order to have a seamless weld, I'm going to use an inner sleeve and a little bit of a gap, and I'm going to weld into the gap. Now the sleeve itself is a 3/4 inch piece that's tacked into the side, leaving me a nice little 1/8 inch gap that I can weld in. Alright, I've got my welds in place. I'm going to be cleaning them up here shortly, but since it has started to rain, I got to pick a few things up and then come on back. It'll be instant for you! Alright, polished it up and now I've got a seamless weld. I'm going to do the final bend. The final bend is going to be kind of in the middle. Final bend will be a 10-degree bend at a 67-inch mark and a 2.5-inch offset. So that's just going to be tilting it to the side. So we have one more bend to make here and here. Now this allows for better wheel clearance here. The only problem with that is some benders don't actually allow for being able to get in once the tube is sealed. You need to come in from an edge. If you notice here, without having the bend in place, the frame jig still works. We've got two shims in place to just help align them. Everything is lined up perfectly where you can use the smaller wheel clearing. When we're putting our wheels in here, it's going to be kind of a tight fit. With a smaller wheel, everything should still work. You are not SOL. With the larger wheel, again, things are going to be getting pretty tight in there as far as clearance goes. With the final bends, I'm going to be putting one of the frame pieces in upside down and one of the frame pieces in right side up so that they're going to get opposing bends. Time for the final wheel clearancing bends. So the neck is pointing forward in my bender, and I'm going to come from the first bend coming down off of the neck. I'm going to make sure that everything is lined up, straight up and down, and I'm going to come out from that bend 2.5 inches on the bottom. I'm going to just lock that down in place. Now with the frame out 2.5 inches, I'm only going to be bending it 10 degrees. Let's get our next piece in there, the same direction, but instead we're going to flip it up. Alright, we once again have this going straight up and down. We're going to go in the same direction now. 2.5 inches. Once again, we're just going 10 degrees. We've got the frame pieces resting in the frame jig over here, and it's time to make a decision of what size neck do we want. What size neck pertains to what kind of forks we want. Now, do we want pre-made forks, or do we want Bink, or do we want to make a triple tree of our own? Bink. Now, for the two videos coming up, I'm going to be using a 4 1/4 inch that's going to be hollowed out to 30 millimeters, and that's going to be for our pit bike forks over here. Then I'm going to be using a 5 inch that's hollowed out at 7/8 of an inch, and that's going to be for our standard mini bike forks that fit Motovox or Megamoto, the MMB80, the RB100, and the various other. If you use a threaded pipe, make sure that you actually clean off all of the black stuff. Don't use galvanized, use the black type. And it does work out pretty well. A 1-inch inner diameter carved out to 30 millimeters works just nicely. 1-inch outer diameter that has a 0.12 inner diameter wall works quite nicely for the 7/8 inch once you shave it on out. In order to get the seats properly made for either the bearings or the bearing races, I'm going to be using step drill bits. Now, step drill bits are typically for sheet metal, but in this particular case, they're the least expensive tool to get the job done. Now that I have my neck in place with the wheel balancers I went over from the part 1 of this, building the frame jig, I've got a duct tape in place. I want between 60 and 65 degree for that neck. I'm going with 62 degrees. With the larger neck size, because you're going to be using bearing races, I'm going to try to make sure that this tip right here lines up to the top of the frame. With the smaller neck size, I'm actually going to be looking to have that neck come up about 1/2 of an inch. When you're setting up to do your tack welds, just keep in mind that your tack weld pulls the metal in, so you want to make sure that your tack welds are set up evenly spaced between the two sides. So the bender that I used was a JD Squared Model 32 bender, and I'm using a 1-inch die and a 3-inch radius on there. So I'm going about the 1:3 ratio that's recommended for our bends. Now the size metal used is a 11 gauge Dom or 0.125. And this isn't necessarily the recommended for a lot of different builds because I'm going to be putting a very large engine on there, the Duramax 18 horsepower stock engine on there, and you're going to be bringing it above 20 horsepower. I wanted a very solid structure in the frame. 0.083 is a very commonly used mini bike frame. 0.091 is also a very commonly used. That's things like drag mini bikes. I'm using 1/4 inch steel for the plate, the axle tab, and the other components that are coming up because I am going to be putting a little bit of power into these things and I want everything structurally sound. Custom, and more custom. We've got a homemade mini bike frame. I'm going to be doing 3 different builds and breaking up the options to show you. See, we've got a variety of seats. We've got different engines, we've got different drivetrains, racing clutch versus CVT, torque converter, large wheel, small wheel, and I'm going to be coming up in the remaining 3 parts of this build series to show you the assembly process for a custom mini bike. So, subscribe, like, I really do appreciate it. Hope you enjoyed the video and I hope you have a great day.